Okay.
So
We get to use the whole crew.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Destina. Destina is a game developer who's co-founder of T-Power Games.
I can give you a slide for that.
Slides for that. So together with Menubased, they develop character-based narrative games, and they also do freelance narrative design. So the game dialogue is really about very subtle incremental narrative choices where relationships are built up essentially through conversation, while elemental flow, which is currently in development, uses psychological metrics to determine states. And then Restless was written by Emily Short,
yes.
and then you did the kind of design.
Yeah, we did kind of UI design behind it and stuff like that.
Okay, and that one is available to play on itch if you're interested. Dialogue is on Steam and
itch and
itch as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great, good. Now, Destina has a PhD in computational neurophysics from Imperial College London.
Which is obviously you need that to be qualified to talk about JRPGs.
But importantly, she also studied Japanese in extramural subject there, and probably did so, well, I'm guessing here, because she's had a lifelong passion for Japanese role-playing games, which we'll be talking about today. So essentially their historical development, their conventions, and what makes them really special and different. So thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Hey, that's me. So yeah, I am Destina. I'm a game designer, narrative designer. Hopefully you're here to hear me talk about interactive narrative in Japanese role-playing games. Otherwise, you're here for kind of a 2-hour introduction, which is actually sort of appropriate for JRPGs. They take about that long. They have been a passion of mine for most of my life, basically as long as I can remember, ever since playing the first Final Fantasy as a kid, which slightly dates me, but and I might be biased because I have spent entirely too much time on them, but I do think they're pretty interesting both from a game design perspective and from the way that game design informs the narrative of these games. I just want to say that there's no prior knowledge required for this talk. It's going to be part primer, part overview, part design analysis. And if it feels like I'm blazing through a lot of potentially deep topics, it's because I am. And hopefully I'm going to walk sort of a satisfying line between being accessible and interesting for people who really don't know that much about Japanese role-playing games at all, but also maybe kind of challenge those of you in the audience who know a thing or two about JRPGs. And you'll see as we move into the talk how that's actually like that balancing those two things, like being challenging to some people and accessible to others, is actually really thematic for JRPGs. So we just talked a lot about me anyway. More importantly for this talk, I'm not Japanese. I don't have a degree studying Japanese culture, and no amount of watching anime, reading manga, and playing JRPGs qualifies me to speak directly about Japanese culture. It's tempting, I think, when discussing JRPGs to make ties between the design and the narrative of these games directly back to like their culture, where they come from. And like that makes sense. The genre is named after the country. I think those ties exist, and that can make for a really interesting analysis. But it's also really easy to fall into the trap of making broad generalizations of the culture and the games, and of assuming that we understand kind of a causality that may not exist, or that we kind of don't completely get from the outside, from our perspective. Moreover, in this talk, I'll already have my hands full, just fully identifying kind of patterns, divergences, diving into what makes those things interesting, and what can be learned from them. And it's a really big genre, as I think I found out many of you already know. And as we're about to find out, it's actually pretty hard to define. So, what is a Japanese role-playing game? What is a JRPG? And it's a really natural question to ask, and it would be pretty hard to have this talk if we can't somewhat answer it. So, yeah, I'm not actually entirely sure. I know this isn't a great start, but bear with me. So genres are notoriously slippery things at the best of times, especially in games, and JRPGs in particular have really evolved and morphed over time, and it makes them really difficult to pin down, like what actually is a JRPG. And that's okay. Personally, I don't mind if game A is a JRPG or game B isn't. We don't really need to worry too much about the hard rules of classification here. But I'm going to be here talking about it for about 2 hours. It has fans. We use it as a description of games. It has a tag on Steam. So we can narrow it down a little bit more than I don't know. And the first thing you might think is made in Japan. And I'm going to set that aside for a bit. We'll get to it. It turns out it's more complicated than that. So, visual style. It's JRPGs often borrow from the visual styles of anime and manga. It's pretty distinct. It's often a common indicator that a game might be a JRPG if you see this sort of anime manga visual style. The visual language of anime and manga really apply to a lot of things in JRPGs. But is it necessary? No. But it helps. When I talk about JRPGs, if you know these games, you might be thinking, it might bring to mind turn-based, menu-based combat, these sort of things where you select an option from a menu and maybe an animation plays out and some numbers happen. And this might come to mind as the thing that you do in a JRPG. Certainly early JRPGs leaned on this, really defined it. This sort of mostly combat mechanic, but mechanics in general, evolved along with the genre. It's definitely more than an artifact. These two things are tied. Is it necessary? No. But it helps. But what kind of stories do they tell? I'm here going to talk about interactive narrative. Nothing gets you labeled a JRPG faster than setting your story in a Japanese high school with a small group of plucky teenagers. There are definitely some narrative patterns that you see repeated in these types of games, narratives which you also see in anime and manga. There's also a lot of fantasy world saving. But maybe that's just RPGs in general. Definitely not all of them. JRPGs are pretty vast, and they tell all sorts of different kinds of stories. I'll be identifying some of the patterns in the narrative later, but this doesn't necessarily pin down JRPGs. But whatever the narrative, we can say that narrative is at the core of these games. Probably. I think that's mostly true. Except that, well, one, there have definitely been games that have ticked a bunch of the boxes I've already put, and some that are to come, which really didn't think that much about the story, so you couldn't say that the narrative was at the core. And two, that's kind of true of a lot of games, because we're here at the monthly interactive fiction meetup. Narrative at its core doesn't really narrow things down a whole lot. So this is important to remember, because I'm going to be talking later about how this ties together a lot of the different and sometimes really weird things that JRPGs do. But we definitely can't stop there. Control schemes, what you're expected to use to control, what platforms they're for. Now, a really quick search on Steam will tell you this isn't comprehensive at all. Historically, it's not even comprehensive. But there is a lot tying some of the more famous JRPG brands, things like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, to early consoles, like the original Nintendo system. Using a controller in those games implied a certain way, a certain perspective, a certain way of interacting with the world, which JRPGs kind of carried into the wider public eye and became a big part of the recurring patterns of the games and the narrative design. This is also important because the closer you look at JRPGs, the more you find they have in common with adventure games, point and click or otherwise. They've got this emphasis on narrative. They have a specific kind of narrative structure. However, JRPGs, because in large part of this, historically, have a distinct way of interacting with the world. And the really easy way to think about that is if point and click adventures have pixel hunting, JRPGs have run against walls and mash the A button. So, identifying factor, no, not really. But again, sort of important to think about. So there's a version of this question where I simply answered, well, a JRPG, a Japanese role-playing game, is an RPG made in Japan. Or by Japanese developers, or tying some lineage to Japanese game development. So what is a role-playing game? What's an RPG? Digital role-playing game, at least, because different definitions in different spaces. A game in which you play a role, that doesn't narrow things down a lot, and often it causes all sorts of additional disagreements about whether that means you're stuck in someone's shoes or someone's shoes are stuck on you. That sounded better in my head. It also doesn't really describe what most people think of or are trying to evoke when they say an RPG. Numbers, though. Numbers that represent characteristics which decide your efficacy at various tasks, various things that you do in the world. That actually goes a long way towards capturing what a role-playing game is, or what people mean when they use that term, at least in the digital space. Not all of them, and certainly not only RPGs have numbers, but I've personally noticed that it suddenly becomes really hard to call a digital game an RPG, or in this case a JRPG, if the numbers are noticeably absent. Take away the numbers, and that's suddenly people stop thinking of it as an RPG. So we've got a bit of a list of things which are sort of indicative of what, like, kind of point us at what a JRPG might be. None of them are deal breakers in their absence. They maybe help to narrow down the space a bit, but it's kind of messy. I think we can proceed a bit further by looking at some examples. So we're going to do what I think is a bit of a time-honored tradition if you play enough JRPGs. We're going to play, is this a JRPG? Now, spoiler warning, I everything that comes after this, I would actually quite happily call a JRPG, personally. But it's still fun to do because I enjoy watching the definition kind of stretch and contort to fit around each of these games. Yeah, it's a JRPG, but wait, it doesn't have this, and it's not doing this, so let's go.
Yeah.
So we're going to start easy. Dragon Quest. So it, along with just a small handful of others, set a lot of the standards by which we define the genre today. It's hard to see in its early 8-bit form, but like in the promotional art, the characters are designed by a renowned manga author. We've got turn-based combat. We've got walking around a world with a controller on a console, with a couple people following around behind you, a party. We're actually gonna see that as a common theme, and I'm gonna come back to it later. We're telling something of a hero's journey to save the world from evil. Narrative at its heart. I might let it slide. It was probably more original 3 decades ago. But definitely a JRPG. Jump ahead. So this is Tales of Vesperia. It's another relatively renowned JRPG series. Now we can really see in the game the anime visual style. We have numbers going on. We're telling a story about fixing a corrupt system from within versus without, amongst other things. We've ditched the turn-based encounters. We flash screen for encounters, but this is active. You press a button to attack, you run around to avoid things. It's still a JRPG, but we've swapped one core mechanic for another. Even if we've still kind of kept the combat. Okay, it's a JRPG, fine. Go back a bit. It's a secret Amano. We already ditched the turn-based combat, so that shouldn't bother us. We've got active combat, we're walking around a world. We don't go to a different screen for encounters, but that didn't even make the list in the first place. We have numbers. Sort of have an anime manga visual style is probably more noticeable in the promotional art. Single player? I never mentioned it before, but most people, when they think JRPG, think it's a thing that you sit down for at least tens of hours, probably on your own because you don't want to deal with other people's reading speeds. But here we have optional multiplayer, and if I'm honest, we kind of did in the previous slide too. But that's fine. Why can't a JRPG be multiplayer? It doesn't really change a lot of the other stuff going on in it. You can play it perfectly happily, single player. Like adding a second person doesn't really change the game, besides make it way easier because the AI sucks. We're still firmly in JRPG franchise territory at the moment. So while we're still here, let's do another really easy one. Let's visit Final Fantasy while we're here. So, okay, so you may or may not know what's going, like you'd be forgiven for not having any idea what's going on in this picture. So this is Final Fantasy XIV, and it's a massively multiplayer online RPG. One which happens to evoke JRPGs all the time. We already kind of bent the single player thing. Can a JRPG be massively multiplayer? It's Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy isn't a JRPG, it's a numbered one of the series. Not even some weird side game. We've got numbers. We've got anime-inspired visual style. We've got fantasy world saving. Okay. JRPG? You'd be forgiven for saying no, but like, hopefully you understand why I would call it a JRPG. Okay, let's get out of this multiplayer nonsense. Valkyrie Profile. We're back to single player. We're back to turn-based combat-ish. It's a little bit active as well. Not exactly going on a fantasy adventure. We're more like on a Norse mythology-inspired War of the Gods plus personal amnesia story. Classic. But we get to run around ruins and fight things with numbers. More parties of characters. And it was really hard to find a screenshot of this, so it's hard to tell here. But when you're walking around Valkyrie Profile, it's actually kind of a 2D platformer. You freeze enemies and jump on them and get to new heights to find treasures and explore this whole 2D map. So it's a 2D platformer JRPG. We can do that, I guess, probably. It's got everything else. Sure. So more recent. Maybe you've heard of it. Fire Emblem Three Houses. So we're in turn-based combat, but it doesn't look like it did before. It's got a grid. We might call it more tactical. I know I said that we usually have a group of characters in JRPGs. In Fire Emblem, it's more like a small army. They all have names and faces and personalities. They're all characters. But it's a few more than 4. We're not fighting any old battles. We've got a bit of high school drama. We've got empires clashing. We've got a war sucks kind of narrative, but you still have to fight it. We also occasionally have tea with people and check out those anime visuals. This game is designed with controller in mind, but like now that we're on a grid, you could easily imagine this like with mouse and keyboard probably. But anyways, like, as long as we're okay with this different kind of combat, which, like, we did active combat instead of turn-based menu, this is still turn-based. Okay, so yeah, like this is a JRPG. We might qualify it. We had a 2D platformer JRPG. Now we have a tactical JRPG because that makes people feel like clever, warlike people. Okay, well, we already have tactical JRPGs. This is Final Fantasy Tactics. It's right in the name. This is easy. It's fine. Move on. It's JRPG.
I could hear those pictures. That music is stuck in your head.
So these are kind of the same game. So this is Felseal Arbiter's Mark, and before you get too worried, this is in fact lovingly inspired by Final Fantasy Tactics years later, not actually ripped off. It's made by not-so-Japanese developers with a less Japanese visual style. Is this a tactical JRPG? So, like, in almost every other way, it's purposely very close to a game that was very happily a tactical JRPG because it had the Final Fantasy label, because it's called Tactics in the name. This game doesn't have the Final Fantasy label. It doesn't have the Japanese pedigree, but belongs directly alongside another game which does. So I would say sure. It's JRPG. But we're already playing a bit loose with the mechanics, and the visual style is not so clear-cut. Now we're finally questioning the connection to the namesake country itself. Do we call this a JRPG once removed? So, hopefully, you get the point that JRPGs are a varied bunch. They've changed over time. I would like to end on what is the traditional wrench in the works of almost any is this a JRPG discussion, though. So this is Dark Souls. It has numbers. No party, no manga visual style, no turn-based combat. Story, kind of? Japanese developer, yeah. There's always the sense, when I've heard this come up in discussion, that Dark Souls is at some kind of boundary between what is a JRPG and what isn't. It's almost moot at that point whether you actually call this a JRPG, but it's right on the boundary. But what's really interesting to me is it's not always clear what that boundary is. If it had clear story, would that make it a JRPG? If you had party members, would that make it a JRPG? If it had a different visual style, would that make it a JRPG? JRPG is certainly not the first descriptor I reach for when I think of Dark Souls, but I also wouldn't quickly exclude it. And part of that is because JRPGs have a lot of variety to them, and that's part of what makes them really interesting. And when you pin them to stereotypes a bit too much, then it becomes less interesting as a label, even if it's a lot clearer. So now, we've talked kind of in terms of like what defines a JRPG, and probably walked away a little bit more confused than we started. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the neat things that JRPGs do typically or have done, and then move kind of a bit more beyond the surface. For now, I'm just going to use the genre label a bit casually, sort of the way that people agree on it, and not get too caught up in this is a JRPG or this isn't a JRPG. Broadly generalizing things is generally a bad idea. So when we talk about interactive narrative, often one of the key touchstones is the structure or the shape of the narrative. What's the possibility space like? How does our interaction with the narrative change it? Let's start with JRPGs then. Fortunately, they're relatively consistent. They might be quite varied in other ways, but narrative structure, they're quite consistent, and I can nicely diagram this out for you. Sorry if I got your hopes up there. So this is what the narrative structure for most JRPGs actually looks like. It's consistent enough, even, that I would argue that this is a big part of defining a JRPG, contrasting with many other kinds of role-playing games. Now, maybe this seems not very noteworthy. At best, it could be a concession, which allows creators to focus on other things, other creative choices. Like, they don't have to worry about various branching paths and whatever, so they focus on their narrative, they focus on the art, whatever else, the mechanics. But I think it's important to respect this as a creative choice. I'm going to do the first of a few slight tangents. I remember reading an interview with the producer of a game called Dragon Quest Builders. So maybe you know it, maybe you don't. This is Minecraft, but with a Dragon Quest skin to it. Now, Minecraft is synonymous with sandbox amongst games. Pretty much the polar opposite of this. And these developers, for some reason, set out to make a version that stayed true to that. But they wanted to make it more approachable to people who might be daunted by the openness of Minecraft, daunted by the lack of clear objectives or in-game motivation. So they applied this to Minecraft. And they ultimately made a pretty successful game, I think. I know there's a sequel, at least. And that's sort of a roundabout way for me to say that this is a choice, not just a concession. It's clear and approachable by design. And where some games might also use like a straight line backbone as set dressing to allow for like a lot of self-motivated exploration around it, most JRPGs go out of their way to make the path clear and primary, with exploration around it optional and a bit secondary. Again, most, there are always exceptions. Speaking of that exploration, though, if JRPGs usually have a clearly defined path, they also often have side quests. Now, these can sometimes get a bit of a bad rap, often by people who have been asked to collect one too many monster pelts for poorly motivated reasons, and I empathize. 2 months ago, we had Emily Short up here talking about storylets in interactive narrative, and I'm actually going to lean on that term here. So I want to give you short version of that here, though. At their heart, side quests are storylets in that they are self-contained nuggets of narrative, which usually highlight characters, locations, or aspects of the world which do not strictly fit into the main plotline. So self-contained nuggets of narrative. They're certainly not unique to JRPGs, but I think JRPGs have their own distinct flavor of side quest. And I'm going to summarize it with two main trade-offs. So, just like we have the clear straight line paths, side quests in JRPGs tend to be very well signposted. They're clearly labeled on characters. This character has a side quest for you. This one doesn't. They are often organized in a menu or log of sorts, and sometimes that menu or log even tells you what side quests are available to you now, not just the ones you've seen. It doesn't necessarily just pick up things that you've already picked up that you could have written down in a notebook. Sometimes it gives you extra information. And here we hit the first trade-off. The more clearly you point at a thing for the player to do, the less optional it feels. These things are meant to be optional, but if you paint a big, blaring, do this thing in front of the player, it doesn't really feel optional. It feels like I want to get that big, blaring thing out of the way, or tick this box. It removes some of the potential joy of discovery. A player feels different when they see a side quest marker and talk to the NPC going, okay, give me the side quest, rather than, hey, I want to talk to that character. Oh, hey, they've got a quest for me. So that's what you lose by clearly signposting this stuff. What do you gain? It's approachable. It probably saves the player time, ultimately, because if they know there are side quests out there and they're not clearly marked, they either give up on them entirely, or what? They go around and talk to every NPC 5 times. It also frees up emotional space that can be focused on other bits of your narrative. It certainly means they're more likely to play a larger percent of the content created. So that's the first trade-off. Side quests in JRPGs are often, not always, but also often accessible at any point in the game after you've unlocked them. It's not universal, but it's common enough that it's worth pointing out. Even if you're right before the giant doors of the final confrontation, you can probably go to the second town and save a cat and tree. And so here we hit the second trade-off. If a side quest can be done at the beginning of the plotline and at the end of the plotline, it actually kind of has to be pretty independent of the plotline. And you have some tools, such as what do you use to unlock that? Maybe you have to have a certain character. Maybe you have to have reached a certain point in the game. But if you're never going to remove that once you have it, it's hard to change the world very much without invalidating those side quests. What do we gain? It gives the player some tools to craft their narrative and play experience within the game itself. If your side quests come and go, you slightly dictate the pace of the player's narrative experience. Sure, they get to decide whether they want to do side quests or not, but given that they're going to do side quests, then they run into this, do some plot, step back and do side quests, do some plot, step back and do some side quests. Because they have to, because if they don't, the side quests are going to be gone. However, if the side quests are kind of permanently available, then a player who's emotionally invested in continuing with the narrative right now can just do it without fear of missing out. They know that later on they can just, okay, well, I'll go back and do this thing later. It kind of allows for a different sort of agency than we sometimes mean when we use that word. Even if it comes with some heavy constraints on the kinds of storylets we can write. Now, a little bit of a side note. Sometimes a balance can be struck between these things. It's not all one or all the other. In Xenoblade Chronicles, where that menu comes from right there, there were specific quests which were unavailable after a certain point in the narrative. Now, without telling you what that certain point was, when it was going to be, or what was going to happen, the game just had a little symbol, that little timer at the bottom, to tell you, hey, this quest isn't going to be around forever. So if you're interested in doing it, maybe do it sooner rather than later. Everything else without that timer, don't worry about it. Do it whenever. Little bit of a historical caveat. If you look at earlier JRPGs, these two trade-offs that I'm talking about were less decided. This is something that's sort of developed as the genre has developed. If you look at older games, it's much more likely you'll find stuff that like side quest pops in, side quest pops out, side quests aren't marked. It's chaos. Amusingly, I sometimes see these sorts of design decisions either called good game design or terrible game design, probably depending on whether you like the old games or not. But really, what I'm just trying to highlight is that it's this creative choice for organizing your narrative, and there are upsides and downsides to it. And JRPGs tend to lean in one direction, which is sort of consistent with the way they do their narratives. So we've got clear, straight-line plots with a cloud of storylets. It's relatively simple. It's not what all JRPGs do. But it's sort of the baseline that you go into these things assuming, and then you see how this game has changed it or whatever. There are a couple somewhat typical exceptions. So multiple characters, each with their own plot line, which sort of intertwine and interact with each other. At any one time, you might be following one character's plotline, and you might kind of alternate between them. You might play them in series. Ideally, in these cases, the interactions between them make the storylines more than just the sum of their parts. This is sort of a subdivision of multiple characters, but with more time involved. Sometimes you get generational plot lines, where you as a player follow a family over many years, generations. Speaking of time travel, JRPGs really like time travel. So all that stuff I said about storylets being available at any time, it turns out time travel is really great for enabling that. One of the earliest and most famous versions of this is the aptly named Chrono Trigger, where you could also start the plot over from the beginning, but keep all your lovely collectible trappings, and it actually coined the term New Game Plus. New Game Plus has gone on to become this sort of common feature in many JRPGs, even when there's no time travel there to frame it. Now, this is largely a convenience and power fantasy concession, but I also would quickly note that it suits JRPG narrative conventions, which largely want you to experience everything within the confines of sort of a single playthrough. Now, is a New Game Plus the same playthrough? They would rather that than require you to make choices which block off that enable some content and block off others. And then very rarely, sometimes they do the branching thing. Sometimes they do it via explicit dialogue choices. Sometimes they do it via the culmination of your play choices, which personally I find much more interesting. However, it also flies completely in the face of the approachable signposting that the rest of the genre leans on. If you're doing things in the background in response to the player and making like implicit choices, that's like the exact opposite of clearly signposting where you're going and what to expect. But so there's more to JRPG interactive narratives than just their structure, their possibility space. And in order to talk about it further, I'm going to start by splitting up what I call the text of JRPG narratives from the texture. So let's talk about the text of JRPG narratives. And what I mean by that is the explicit events, themes, settings, patterns that are typical of JRPG plotlines. The stuff that's in the words directly there in the story, what they're telling you. It's not a given with game genres that you would have specific patterns of the text. Often game genres describe mechanics or control style. But as established, JRPGs are messy, and they are sometimes identified just as much by their story as by the trappings around it. And there are definitely a few patterns that stand out. But there are a lot of these stories, so this is far less of a comprehensive guide to what you will find in all JRPGs, and more like the highlights, where each one probably deserves its own talk. So by far the biggest one, as it happens, JRPGs generally need fighting. So they need something to fight and a reason to fight it, as well as like an arc of growth, because levels. Often it's monsters that you're fighting, rarely it's other people, and usually you're following some kind of hero's journey. It's a little bit bland, but I can't deny its presence. Now, I should point out that this isn't like the only facet of the JRPG narratives that even use this. Very often they'll use this world-saving hero's journey backdrop to tell very human, characterful stories within that aren't really about saving the world, but that's kind of just good storytelling. Also, JRPGs, much less often a single character's hero's journey, as it is a group of characters kind of doing their hero's journey together, maybe slightly separate, but at the same time. But we're going to talk about parties again later. They also tend to be really optimistic-ish. They can have dark subjects, but most JRPGs, you can expect them to end relatively well for the people involved. And for the world at large. Which is good, because one of the major themes is that humanity is messing up the world. Now, this might seem really trite now, because global warming, but this has been true basically since the beginning of the genre. Sometimes it involves greedy individuals. Very often it involves humanity's own systems eating away at sort of a thinly veiled magical environment metaphor, which is usually called mana. There are clear ties to this, again, historically in anime and manga. I promised I wouldn't draw too many cultural ties, though there are some very specific origins there. But telling stories about humans' relationship to nature also allows them to treat, with the non-human, it's not that uncommon to have, like, talking animals, even talking animal party members in JRPGs, which I think you don't see as often elsewhere. So maybe this is just like an RPG thing as opposed to a JRPG thing. Or you can sort of hand-wave it as the inevitable result of, like, constantly escalating conflict. You have to fight bigger and bigger and bigger, and at some point you get to this. But whatever the reasons, if you play a JRPG, you can probably expect a showdown with some deities. Probably to an epic choir. It does have a relationship to the JRPG narratives. The common theme is like standing up to powerful, the inevitable, the dogmatic, which honestly I find a little bit ironic because JRPGs themselves can be a little bit dogmatic. But so I was having a discussion recently with a family member. We were talking about great literature, our relationship and personal connections to specific kinds of literature and things in them. And this person I was speaking with, they described how much of a formative experience it was for them to read a book where the author was also a character in the book. The book was clearly aware of their presence as a reader. And I appreciated that. Like, I kind of continued with the conversation. I nodded and smiled and thought that was great. It was only later, when I was thinking about it, that I realized my first experience of that kind of postmodern meta acknowledgement was when I was 6 years old, playing a Game Boy game where the final challenge was a character named only the creator telling me that I was the first to finish the game. So JRPGs definitely did not invent these sorts of meta-narrative, acknowledge the player-author relationship techniques, but they sure as heck embraced them from very early on, and they consistently lean on them. So it can feel like a little bit of a gimmick. Yes, I get it. You're an author, you made a thing, I am the player, hi. But when a genre consistently plays with these things, you find variations. It starts to look less like a gimmick and more like a tool, one that can be deployed, withheld, and refined. So sometimes, when JRPGs use this, it's a framing device. Sometimes it's a plot twist. Sometimes it's a joke or an Easter egg. Sometimes it's a statement. And sometimes it isn't even explicit. But they can trust that the genre conventions carry the subtext. So let's talk about settings. Medieval fantasy, science fantasy. Both of those allow for solving problems with swords and some kind of magic. Also lets you inhabit a world that is not exactly densely packed with people. perhaps far more interesting and pretty JRPG specific, however, is modern magical realism. Now, I'll be honest, I think I've probably walked around the Shibuya Scramble Crossing in Tokyo digitally more often than I've walked down Liverpool Street. When you set your story in a modern magical realism backdrop, it instantly adds so many interesting questions and challenges. How recognizable is it? How crowded is it? How do you manage that from a technical standpoint? Surely you can't approach every NPC and mash the A button and expect them to say something. What are you fighting? And I would, of course, raise my hand and say, do you have to be fighting? And so, usefully, JRPGs have had a go at that several times, and it kind of provides interesting data. So that's like a very brief overview of the kind of stuff you can expect in the text of JRPGs. Now I want to talk about the texture. And I'll admit, so far, up to this point in the talk, there are some interesting tidbits here and there, but you'd be forgiven for thinking that we're looking at essentially hack and slash D&D campaigns with less choice, anime art, and their own kind of loosely defined brand of style. But interactive storytelling... But now we're going to start to move past simply what you can expect from JRPGs and start talking about kind of why I love them. Quickly clarifying what I mean by texture here, it means different things in different contexts. I'm using it here to talk about all the things the game uses outside of the literal words, which modify or inform the experience of the narrative. So everything the game uses that still affects your narrative, but not the words, the story it's telling you. And I've mentioned this a few times. Broad generalization of anime or manga art style, but what I've not explicitly pointed out is that this kind of derives from the fact that character designers and artists are at the heart of Japanese game production in a way that's not true outside of Japan. It's a relationship that was established very early on. I'd have to check my sources on this, but I remember reading that Enix, an early RPG publisher, which you might recognize when they became part of Square Enix, when they sought out new talent to try to get into this genre, they didn't advertise just to computer developers. They also advertised to manga authors and artists. And thus we got Dragon Quest. These were artists and writers who were accustomed to telling stories as much with a series of expressions or a hairstyle as with words. And today, like flash forward, I think it's not uncommon to see someone who cut their teeth doing character design credited now as like a creative lead. And you can tell when you look at the games, you look at the characters. So as a result, JRPG characters often have lively expressions, colorful hair, ridiculous fashion, probably too many belts. And most of that was consciously put together by somebody asking themselves, how can I express this character? Unless they were designing one of the many bad female outfits, in which case I give them far less credit. Once you've grown accustomed to it, once you understand the visual language, you can actually tell a lot about a character just by looking at them. And while leaning on that kind of thinking too heavily can lead to repeated tropes, stereotypes, using it well, which many of these games do, can shortcut or relegate to subtext a lot of character development and let the storyteller express with events and words the nuance, the differences, the interesting bits. That's not to say that games outside of JRPGs don't do this. They definitely do. But I do want to highlight how much this is a part of the DNA of JRPGs, like really from the beginning. JRPG music is expressive and varied. And I'm sorry I can't play the track that goes along with the scene. I was worried about copyright stuff. If the character designs and art shortcut you to character development, the music gives you atmosphere and mood. This is especially important in JRPGs because the vast majority of them do not use a narrator of any kind. And that's a creative choice which distances them from many other RPGs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But JRPG music is not afraid to tell you what to feel. And maybe that rubs some people wrong. Just as a story, in theory, shouldn't tell the player what to do or choose, the game should not tell the player what to feel. And certainly there's a bit of risk involved. If the player isn't feeling the way that the creator has predicted for this when they've set out the music, there can be a mismatch there. And if you push hard with the music, then maybe you alienate or you kind of remove valid alternate reads on a situation. Okay, fine, but I mean, let's be real, there are mute buttons and volume sliders. And moreover, I can identify all my favorite JRPGs just from their soundtracks. And personally, I don't think they would work without them. And I mention this here because that's not a given for any game, and I don't think it's given quite as much discussion in this space as it probably should be. But what do you do in a JRPG? So I've mentioned a few times that you fight. Generally speaking, you walk around, you probably interact with things, inspect things. There are lots of numbers, so menus happen at some point. We're always telling a story, so text, you instigate it, you scroll through it, you read it, usually dialogue between characters. But there's actually a lot more than just that. That's sort of the baseline in many ways. So much more that it gets its whole other section in a minute. But I wanted to highlight here that what you do in the game and how that feels informs the experience of the narrative. Sometimes the beats of a fight scene or the necessary motions to navigate a dungeon carry the weight of the story. And JRPGs know this on average, and they use it consistently. So before I move on to that section about mechanics and what you're doing in JRPGs, I'm a little bit conscious that I've kind of gone through this, and I'm talking at an interactive fiction group where we can like appreciate the beauty of an engine like Twine, where one person can sit down and make something beautiful on their own with like just writing. Many of the things that I mentioned in this section, expressive, vibrant character design and art, rich and varied music, a lot of different content, it sort of can like lean on ye old purse strings. In actuality, I think the relationship between JRPGs and the ever-increasing production value of games that are more kind of widely focused for a wider audience is really complicated and worthy of yet another talk. I could give these talks every month. I'm going to stay on track, but I do think at the very least that being aware of JRPGs and their successes in these spaces, even if you don't have that kind of budget, can affect the way you use them. It can inform narrative design in other spaces. There is actually like a quick call out, like RPG Maker, if you don't know it, is built around making the surface elements of older JRPGs easy to make, allowing the creator to focus on the storytelling among other things. And there's lots of interesting experiments that have done there, and honestly, me calling them interesting experiments is doing them a disservice. There's a lot of great games that have been made there. But I promise to look at what you do in JRPGs. And honestly, what the heck that has to do with telling stories that are basically straight lines. So, I don't know how many of you were here for this, but last year we had a talk by Tom Kale, who works over at Inkle Studios, where he spoke about identifying and valuing what he called activities. Personally, I'm a big fan of this way of thinking, and it's really useful when thinking about JRPGs. So I'm going to lean on it. but I'll give you the short filtered version now. Filtered through me, anyways. Maybe I've got it completely wrong. Activities are, at least in this case, actions which represent more than the very basics of say, clicking through text or simple navigation. So that those aren't activities. It's a bit more than that. But generally not so intricate that you would think of them as puzzles. So somewhere between, those are our sort of bookends. There's little doubt with an activity that the player will get through it. They're probably, they're not going to get stuck. But at the same time, there is value in the carrying out of the activity. It holds narrative weight on some level. And this distinction is really important between activities and puzzles, things that challenge you, or things that just hold narrative weight in doing them. Because I think understanding that is at the heart of JRPG storytelling. So the lowest hanging fruit of what you do at the core of most JRPGs, I've already mentioned. You walk around, you fight, you ponder numbers, you initiate and read text. Every so often you do environmental puzzles. But I actually think, I would say that JRPGs have built into them a sort of internal conflict. On one hand, they want to present a challenge to overcome. When you fight, you can lose. You make choices informed by numbers, preparation, sometimes active skill, and you succeed or fail. I mentioned environmental puzzles. You could get stuck. Does block A go to switch B? What order do I activate these doodads in? And why on earth did I not pack ice skates? But are these things about their challenge? Are they about the fact that you can succeed or fail? Consider that one of the earliest JRPGs, certainly the one most widely regarded as defining the genre, Dragon Quest, was specifically built with the ideas of approachability and accessibility at its heart. The main thing it innovated in that space of RPGs was being more approachable, more accessible. It focused on what its creators saw as the essence of RPGs, because JRPG wasn't really even a thing yet. The essence of RPGs at the time, and attempted to make everything else basically easier. They pioneered a simpler stats and combat system. They made a level curve, which had the player rapidly gain strength early and then sort of trail off later to remove a lot of unnecessary battling. They focused on making it possible to play happily without any prior experience with these sorts of games or Dungeons and Dragons, which was revolutionary and in some ways still is. I pick up some RPGs and that just use Dungeons and Dragons, and if you don't understand Dungeons and Dragons, you have no idea how to allocate your stats. The game was also chunked into smaller, story scenarios, which allowed the player to sort of ramp up to the narratives of the final confrontation. Also gave you better exit points. It was also made for the original Nintendo system. So that simplified the controls. You had an A button, a B button, and a D-pad. You also had start and select, but they were sort of invisible on the controller anyways. Home console release meant that, in contrast to arcades at the time, dying didn't mean the end or spending more money. And that sounds really ridiculous for me to say that now, but that wasn't a given at the time. It actually just meant that you try again from wherever you last saved, though I think technically the first one used passwords, which they really regretted and rolled back later. In other words, the game which defined JRPGs as a genre was designed heavily around the idea that these types of actions, these types of games are engaging. These actions have value, even if it's significantly less challenging, less knowledge intensive, and your progress is far more inevitable. It took a big step towards using the RPG tools as activities as much as, if not more than, challenges. But some, perhaps most of the value of activities in constructing a narrative are getting the player to feel something. Now, that can be feel with a capital F, as in sadness, excitement, anger, or it can be feel with a lowercase f, like feeling like they're operating this valve or feeling like they're pushing this block. Just a simple task which helps set the scene, helps kind of put them there. Anecdotally, I'm playing in a slightly older JRPG now where I had to activate a valve. And this is essentially just like a basic switch in the world. They could have just had me walk up to it and press a button and it activated an open door. Fine. What they did instead was I walk up to it and I hold a button to put my hands on it, and then I rotate the analog stick to like rotate this valve. And it was really simple. There was like no way to fail this or not understand what was going on. And it was so powerful. Like, it was so different than if I had just walked up to it and pressed A.
What game is that?
I'm playing Wild Arms 3 at the moment. It's actually pretty good. But, okay, so activities are trying to get you to feel something through the actions that they're evoking. But what are the activities of battling and adventuring in a fantasy world trying to make you feel? Well, certainly part of it is that you are being challenged, that you're overcoming things, you're in danger, you have some growth, you have heroic triumph. So maybe you start to see the internal contradiction I was talking about before, at the heart of JRPGs. So we want to tell a story through activities, and those activities can uniquely and powerfully do their job when they're not so complex and difficult that they get in the way. Otherwise, you just start to feel frustration instead of the thing that it's trying to get you to feel. But part of the feeling that they're trying to convey is challenge and triumph, especially through wit and hard work. So they need to be challenging enough, threatening enough to evoke these things, but not too challenging that they stop being activities and start being just frustrations, walls. The point at which the book tells you can no longer read further, because that happens all the time. And obviously where that stands, that's not objective. That's different per player. It can cause schisms and arguments within the audience for these games. What's the point of this feature? This mechanic went too far. I even think it's part of what makes JRPGs really hard to define as a genre. So I started this talk by kind of highlighting how messy that is. And genre fitting is sort of a can of worms that I don't really want to get into here. But often, for better or worse, we define game genres by their mechanics. What you do in the game, which also, incidentally, often informs the form or the shape or the history and influences on that game. With JRPGs, we can point at a core of like surface things that they have in common. But I would sort of postulate that the core of JRPGs is telling stories through activities. So let me back that up a little bit. In one game, you race/battle on a motorcycle, you shoot hoops, you train a dolphin, and you snowboard. And you also walk, talk, fight, all the other stuff I've been talking about in JRPGs. And, like, frankly, this isn't the exception. It's kind of the norm. You might hear people bemoaning mini games in JRPGs, but usually I think that's more just a sign that the activity was a little bit out of place, or didn't quite hit the feeling, or was too challenging unnecessarily. Forgot that it was trying to be an activity. And what about those environmental puzzles I've mentioned a couple times? They're pretty common, and really I'd say only the most extreme actually gate the experience. Most of them just require a little bit of thought or trial and error. And I apologize for anybody in the room who has gotten stuck in an environmental puzzle, because I definitely have. And that's really just, most of them are really easy, but there are so many of them. And if you play enough of these games, you'll get stuck. It's just the 99.99% thing. I promise you're not bad at puzzles. So here's an example of a JRPG which I think made a big impact for a lot of people, Golden Sun. By understanding that at their heart, these environmental puzzles were actually just opportunities for the player to do an activity. It was an opportunity for the player to feel like they have these different magical powers and they're manipulating the environment. Was it challenging to use the rain spell on the fire? To use your ice spell to raise a column out of a puddle? To like magically move blocks with your hands? You didn't really have that many applicable options at any one time. But the simple connections that the player makes, the feelings that they get pulling out their repertoire of magical abilities in a context that is different than select thing from menu and do numbers on enemy. It brings the world and the characters and the feelings of the narrative much closer. So, to bring that back, I think activities are at the heart of interactive narrative in JRPGs. Some of those activities are nuanced and systemic, like combat. Some of the activities can seemingly come out of nowhere, but they all form a critical part of the storytelling. And understanding this, I think, makes for wonderful straight line structure interactive narratives that are more than just a straight line. But how do we handle this internal contradiction of challenging activities? There's even, I'm sure, a sub-audience, and maybe some of you are in this audience, who would argue with me that the whole point of the games is to be challenged. Unfortunately, JRPGs have contorted and bent over backwards to manage this identity crisis. Sometimes they do it well, sometimes they do it poorly, but they have tried. I think some of the answer to this is built right into the core of the genre. So I haven't talked a lot about experience points, leveling, often maligned grinding. And these are tools in most JRPGs which allow a player to modulate the relative difficulty of the experience. In a lot of JRPGs, you're rarely truly stuck. Now, spending a couple of hours doing road activity to continue on is not ideal, I agree, but it's better than nothing, having no recourse to continue. Moreover, it's also a little bit self-correcting. There are many places in which if you're having a hard time, you're just going kind of innately battle more and get more experience and end up higher level until you can continue on naturally. JRPGs are also home to many optional systems, so things like crafting, detailed character customization, the side quests I was talking about at length earlier. And the more a player engages with these systems, the easier the rest of the game becomes. Moreover, there's again a bit of player agency here, a player who is specifically seeking more challenge because they want that as part of their experience, maybe because it's more evocative of the hero's journey for them, or maybe because they've just played entirely too many of these things and are looking for something different. You can avoid these systems, or you can use those systems and twist them to make the game harder. JRPGs also often include completely optional extra challenges, so think like super hard boss battles that you don't ever have to do if you don't want to. You could easily see this as not having anything to do with the interactive narrative, and for the most part, you're probably right. But for that group of players that want more challenge, it's like we're kind of siphoning our challenge budget for the game off to the side. So those people can still have their challenge. It can still feel like the same kind of hero's journey interactive narrative challenging thing that they wanted without it getting in the way of so many other players who get to just do the thing much more straightforwardly. And this isn't all just compromise or independent of the narrative in JRPGs. The systems which all mean that ultimately, if you put in the time, you'll get through. If you put in the time, everything will be all right, independent of most skill-based challenges. They also happen to support the kinds of narrative which are common in JRPGs. Hard work leads to success. Stick with it, don't give up, and you'll get there. These are common tenets in JRPG narratives. Some people call JRPGs power fantasies, which is valid. Personally, I often call them a hard work fantasy, where I get to live the dream that the only thing between me and success is putting in the hours. Now, personally, I have mixed feelings about this messaging. Just because that messaging is there does not make it good. But I think it's worth highlighting that relationship between the systems and the story. I also think that being aware of that relationship lets some intrepid storytellers and designers subvert it. But there are fewer examples of that, and I'm getting sidetracked again. So, I will point out that I am being excessively forgiving to some of these games in this analysis, where everything has a purpose. If something's too hard, it's because it kind of had to be. If it's too easy, it's because it's being an activity. As a genre that has been around for decades, and that frankly was not simple when it started. It's evolved and morphed, and even with the best of intentions, it can be and often is sort of accidentally difficult through complexity alone. Unfortunately, this runs into issues of not just game literacy, but genre literacy, and sometimes even franchise literacy, like good luck playing your first Saga game. And I don't have an easy solution for that. Even when you know about it, it's not easy to just like cut that out. Because at the end of the day, it's hard work having a variety of mechanics. Some of them are systemic, some of them are ad hoc. They convey nuance in a way that feels natural and allows the storytelling to shine without leaning too heavily on conventions, which would allow newcomers to get a foothold. Some games are notable in their experimentation with this. Paper Mario comes to mind, where there's something like 3 stats and numbers start at like 1 and go up to 20 instead of starting at 132.5 and going to like 9 million. And not every game should try to appeal to everybody, of course. But it's nice to think about the interesting stuff that arises when people from different bubbles in games and storytelling gain access and help the genre continue to evolve and grow. So I'm going to move on from this. Activities are a varied and important storytelling tool. The ways in which JRPGs lean on them. There's kind of a delicate and often, I think, not well understood balance between activity and challenge. I'm going to put that in a box. Because there is one more passion I have, which is relatively common to JRPGs and a really big part of their storytelling. That's the characters. It is a common, though not universal, setup in JRPGs to let the player follow an initial main character. Somewhat control their actions. You somewhat stand behind them while they whine about how reluctant they are to be a hero. But then other characters join you. Their initial motivations sort of blend into broader motivations, and all of a sudden, you're sort of controlling the main character, but you're also sort of controlling these other characters. You choose their actions in various activities. They take part in dialogue that you instigate. They follow you as you navigate. They rarely leave your side. And if they do, it's often temporary, right to the end of the game. These characters are collectively referred to as the party, and they're not unique to JRPGs, but again, I think JRPGs handle them uniquely. And if you look at this from the outside, from a storytelling perspective, that's actually like a really big deal. It's a pretty hefty restriction on the narrative that, like, well, so this narrative has to center on a core 4 to 8 characters instead of 1. It leads to some fascinating affordances, though, when it comes to the relationship between the player and these characters. So I think that trade-off's pretty worth it. And we're going to start by talking about kind of a storytelling device that's crucial in basically any format, but is both interesting and delicate in an interactive space. That's your perspective. So I'm talking like first person, second person, third person perspective here. If you controlled one character, the main character, if you saw their inner thoughts from their perspective, you made choices and took actions as or through them, we might allow for first person. It's not perfect, but it'd be pretty close. If we had a narrator who talked us through, like a lot of D&D based RPGs, they are quite happy to grimly describe, you regard the sagging flesh of the old man as you ponder your reply. That's a pretty solid second person, you, right there. It's also really interested in evoking a game master-player relationship. But that kind of narrator is notably absent from most, if not all, JRPGs. So are we left with third person? But you're moving a character in the world. You're dictating most of their actions, though with maybe some limited narrative agency, that feels a bit more personal than third person usually implies. So we kind of have a first person narrative going on, especially when we have inner thoughts. But then like 3 to 7 more characters join up for varying reasons and don't exactly give us first person perspective, but definitely give us more than we would just have from the main character's first person perspective. Take, for example, that JRPGs are generally quite happy for you, the player, to see a conversation between 2 of your party members with your so-called protagonist not present. That sort of thing happens in more cinematic games, but not in a lot of RPGs. Usually you need your avatar in the world there, observing the conversation. If I wanted to complicate things, I would point out again that JRPGs are fond of meta-narrative acknowledge the player shenanigans, which muddies up perspective even more. We could start calling on more nuanced, maybe cinematic versions of perspective to more carefully define it. But what I'm trying to convey more than anything else here is this. The party of a JRPG is not just a group of individual characters. It's often treated in the game sort of more like a weird multicellular organism with the player as the brain. So it's obviously not the only genre of fiction or form of fiction that plays with perspective, but perspective definitely plays a key role in JRPGs. When parties are handled clumsily, I think it can lead to a bit of groupthink narrative. The characters hardly feel like they reflect the depth that you would hope for from a bunch of characters in a narrative. They can even feel inconsistent, like their individuality is coming second to the main character / the player / the game's sort of assumed motivations. When it's done well, however, this perspective allows you a closeness to these characters that is, I think, rarely afforded by other means. You get to really know these characters through all the tools of the medium. I've said it a few times, the rich visual design of characters, typical of the genre, really comes to bear on party members. This is so true that you can usually comically spot a party member long before they join the party just from their character design. You don't just get the inner thoughts of the main character or one character. You often get the inner thoughts of all your characters in some form or another. Inner becomes a little bit more outer. Sometimes this gets lengthy or a bit gimmicky as each character takes turns putting their catchphrase spin on whatever's going on in the narrative. But it can also add characterful nuance to the plot points. Far more interesting to me is that many JRPGs employ all sorts of different forms of conversation or conversational snippet to give you more than just the essence of the character. JRPGs make use of things like end of battle quotes, random conversations while you're traveling, random conversations that are instigated by events but sit alongside the main narrative. Sometimes it has characters break away from the main group to just have a chat amongst themselves. Sometimes it involves the whole group. This really takes full advantage of the somewhat obscene length of these games. The end result is, when it's done well, I think, that the characters feel more lived alongside. I hesitate to say real, but it encourages a relationship that I think feels more natural than a character you simply relate to within a narrative. It's more like a good friend from work or a family member you get along with. Because after all, those sorts of natural relationships are built up around a series of moments, often with many different contexts, and that's what these can give you. But these are just the textual ways in which you get to know these characters. As party members in a JRPG, you have a whole additional axis on which to get to know these characters, the way in which they play. This is where the activities I spoke about at length previously can really combine with the characters to build a sense of understanding, history, and relationship. Again, we can use these things as a method for evoking feeling with the player. Capital F and lowercase. Broadly speaking, if a character is arrogant in the text, you might have a very different relationship with them if they're indispensable when things get hard versus if they're really awkward to use in combat. If a character is kind in their words and then is mechanically always protecting other people, you might feel more of a closeness to that particular character facet. It's sort of a show don't tell, but actually in practice I think it's often show and tell, and both work quite well. But this is a bit abstract. And honestly, I never pass up an opportunity to talk about what I consider a shining example of this, which is Final Fantasy IV.
That's the one I played.
That is a good one to have played. It's old and it's a bit simple, but it does this beautifully. So let me set this scene for you. The main character of Final Fantasy IV starts the game in the service of a nation at war with others. Wars which he is obligated to fight in, but clearly does not believe in. He's uncertain, but he pushes forward, believes in his duty, believes in his station. His primary mechanic in battle is to sacrifice his own health to hit harder or hit more. It's a simple mechanic. It's one which leans into JRPG number crunching, balancing of resources. But do a little bit of a double take on that. In order to succeed, he hurts himself to hurt others. Just as he doubts, he loses little pieces of his humanity to carry out his orders and press on. Later in the story, things turn. He finds himself defending those he once fought, but he can't do it with the same tools. Instead, he has to change. He must awaken a new power. He confronts himself in a battle which is won by choosing not to fight at all. He transforms from, in this game's lingo, a dark knight into a paladin. Becomes a warrior who has the ability to heal others and to dive in front of others to protect them. His empathy has gone from hurting himself to being his strength. All in terms which are common and mechanical to JRPGs. There's a little girl who wields magic both to harm and heal. She faces a tremendous trauma and ultimately resolves to move forward by casting aside her healing magic. She toughens up as she grows up to face the world. They're a pair of twins, one kind and attentive, the other mischievous. They wield opposite forms of magic, but they only get to do great, somewhat unpredictable things in battle when they actually work together. There's an old sage. He's plagued by memory issues and the frailty of years. He starts with only a small selection of spells. And then, at a particular moment in the narrative, he has an epiphany. He remembers them all, every spell in the game. But he doesn't have the resources to cast them all. And he never will. No amount of leveling or grinding gets him the magic that he needs to cast all the spells he now knows. List goes on. There's an impulsive, born with a silver spoon in his mouth prince who literally fights by throwing resources from your inventory at the enemy. But perhaps my favorite is the main character's closest friend, who has only one special action that he can take in battle. He's called a Dragoon, which has special and, again, specific, almost typical mechanical meaning in JRPGs. He uses a jump attack. He leaps off the screen and at some point, often unpredictably, comes back doing a lot of damage. The thing about this character, though, is that this character is both old friend and rival to the main character. He's driven by jealousy, among other things, and at a number of points in the game, he betrays you, leaving at the worst times, only to return at a later point, often saving your party from defeat. He acts in the narrative exactly as he acts in battle, selfishly protecting himself from harm by leaving when things get tough, and unpredictably returning, dramatically saving the day. I describe these things just so, but these are not highlighted in the game. They're just there. Many of these mechanics are combat mechanics you can find in other JRPGs, and it would be straightforward to read the narrative separate from the combat mechanics. But in this manner, you don't just read the characters. You build a feeling for them, a relationship with them, that extends from words to actions. I think you get almost a mundane understanding, which is in its own way profound. While there are few activities in this game outside of the walking, talking, fighting combination, because it was a pretty early JRPG, there are many key moments in the narrative where the characters employ these same abilities to excellent dramatic effect, and that invites you to cross the boundaries between the narrative and the combat. So that's the party, the characters, the relationship you build with them. I hopefully have given you kind of the highlights of JRPGs, some thoughts on how this affects the narratives of these games, inspired some thoughts on what this could mean for other interactive narratives, and I could end there. However, JRPGs are also a really weird bunch with a lot of experiments and interesting trials in interactive narrative and game design, which don't fit neatly into the analysis I've done. So I'm going to end on sort of a whirlwind tour of some of the interesting experimentations in JRPGs. They've tried a lot of things. And even if you're not interested in JRPGs, these can easily inform other sorts of interactive narrative. So parties are the standard, but they're not the only way in which JRPGs have taken an interest in how you mechanically interact with characters. My first example of a companion character, so a character who kind of walks around alongside you, you don't control them, they kind of do stuff, they help, mostly you scream at them to point the right way. It was actually an old Game Boy game. And I learned a lot from that game, what felt good and what felt frustrating, what felt empowering to me, and what made me feel like there was another person there alongside me. And that's the kind of stuff that has taken other games a long time to try and then kind of end up stumbling over all the same stuff that I learned from an old Game Boy game. At a whole other scale, Fire Emblem and other tactical JRPGs play around with armies of individuals, so I mentioned this briefly. How much and what kind of detail can you deliver with so many characters? How many relationships feel good? What kinds of relationships feel good? How do these things intersect with the gameplay? How do you build up these relationships? What are their benefits? How about what activity? I talked about activities and I talked about the party, but mesh those things together. What activities can the characters perform in the world outside of combat and dialogue options? And how does this feel? How does this make the character feel? In the case of Octopath Traveler, which I'm highlighting here, each of the main characters has like a characteristic activity that they can do, a way that they can interact with all the NPCs of the game. And that ended up not just enriching the characters themselves, but enriching the entire world. Because when you think of NPCs, non-player characters, in a game, perhaps they have some visual design, they have some text associated with them, they have a position in the world or the narrative, and they have some amount of quest relevance. Fine. Okay. But due to the many ways in which these characters could interact with the NPCs, almost all of the NPCs in Octopath Traveler also had a personal inventory, which you could buy or steal from. Combat mechanics for dueling them. Were they weak or strong? These are random people on the street you could challenge to a duel. They have deeper inner thoughts, which you could access either by a Sherlock Holmes-style scrutinizing or amicably socializing with them. They also had a way in which they could assist you in battle because you could invite them to come along, be sort of a temporary party member. Each and every one of these elements was tacked on to not all, but almost all of the NPCs in Octopath Traveler, and it made the world so rich. Speaking of NPCs, JRPGs have a lot of them. And they range from the lowly signpost to basically anything created by Nihon Falcon, where even the random inhabitants of a town will often recur and evolve over time. I've spoken a lot about the activities and conventions of JRPGs, but I cannot underscore the copious amounts of text in JRPGs and their proximity to visual novels, which has meant that they've experimented with a lot of different takes on text and how the player experiences text. So this ranges from typical portrait and text box with a variety of shapes and sizes and backings and amount of text and amount of character animation to embedding in the world, getting the sizing, the placement, the timing of that just right. For what it's worth, I think Final Fantasy IX pulled off comic timing better than a lot of previous JRPGs, thanks in part to the way they handled the text. We've got, I think, slightly more boring, more familiar cinematic subtitle style. They've done a lot of experimentation with when and how often do you stop the action for text versus when do you play it alongside things happening. Where is the player's focus? Can they be doing this thing while listening to text or reading it? And they've done so many different parameterizations of voice acting, not voice acting, partial voice acting, sound effects to go along with the text deployment, amount of text on the screen at once. Anybody interested in deploying any kind of text on a screen can learn a lot from what JRPGs have done. I mentioned activities and mini games, but that's a really broad category. And honestly, it's quite hard because a certain amount of bespoke design goes not only into each activity itself, but how it's embedded and used in the game. JRPGs have done a lot of things, and sometimes it goes well, and sometimes it goes poorly, and sometimes it goes controversially. But whenever I have to think about adding an activity to a game, I go through a mental checklist of, have JRPGs done this before? Usually the answer is yes. Did it go well? You can expect festivals with implicit choices alongside low-stakes tutorials, full arcades, collectible card games, really, really big and detailed collectible card games, so much fishing, cooking, crafting, collecting, and these range from like the really basic action command to full system treatment, entire games built just around the crafting, entire series built around the games, built around crafting. And the thing that I kind of glazed over that is at the core of so many RPGs, whether they're JRPG or not, leveling, experience systems. It's wormed its way into fitness apps. JRPGs have had decades to play around with this, refine them, experiment with them narratively. That includes trying what do big numbers feel like? What do little numbers feel like? What do medium numbers feel like? What is a medium number? What kind of pacing of the leveling do you want, and how does that sit alongside your story? What if you don't have levels? You just increase stats based on usage. What effect does that have? And it kind of creates a sort of procedural storytelling of its own kind, even within the internal linear narrative. Again, saga games. I play too many saga games, and they're really hard. What if you level according to narrative milestones instead of experience points in battling? What if each level is more of a change in kind? What if your whole party levels up at the same time? What if it's like a shared level of experience? Sometimes JRPGs question what level and experience even mean. What if you got weaker past a certain point because level is actually representing your age and you're getting older, frailer? If you level by fighting, what if level is basically just the measure of your violence? They also have all sorts of alternate numerical systems. This is Valkyrie Profile again. You have approval rating of the gods, that is, which seems good until it's not. I talked earlier about experience and leveling allowing a certain amount of flexibility in the sort of challenge activity balance, but with the downside of requiring time or grinding and also not being so explicit. Not saying, if you want this game to be easier, go get higher in level. Some JRPGs actually take that completely to another level. I didn't intend that pun. I'm sorry. Allowing you to just choose what level you are. Or turn experience points off entirely. Turn random encounters off entirely. Honestly, the games involved pictured here have led to some of the most fantastic experiences for me. And I think it's really testament to how important accessibility, whether you're talking about genre literacy or just the physical ability to manipulate a controller a specific way, that's important for everybody. It just makes it better. I have also alluded to, but conveniently not addressed, how long these games can be. I'm still not really going to address it. I'm sorry. I understand why it's not appealing. I also just wouldn't easily deride it. It's complicated like everything else, trade-offs. But, accept that for a second. I certainly have. Few games have done more work to consider the narrative pacing of an experience that's going to be that long. If you're comparing to other media, you start to shift from like cinema to more like a television series. You shift from short stories to chunky novels to book series. As always, nothing quite compares between different media. And it's a difficult thing to learn just through player testing and iteration. How do we pace this story at 20 hours, at 40 hours? You can test the experience of the first hour, maybe even several hours of your interactive narrative, over and over. You can do that. But how do you test over and over the experience of your narrative at 40 hours, at 80 hours? And JRPGs make for a great resource in seeing all the different takes. They're sort of all case studies on what can you do with narrative that is different, good, bad, at varying lengths. They're also a great reference for seeing different takes on how you unveil the mechanics alongside the narrative, how you pace those things. Do you kind of do it at the same time, or do you stagger them so the player is always interested in one or the other and kind of bounces back and forth? There are whole branches of game design and narrative design which have a tendency to skip from the first 10 minutes or hour to forever. Like we can design the first 10 minutes to an hour, and we can design for forever. But I'm not talking about that. I think most JRPGs aren't built to go on forever. They're built to end. They're just meant to be long. In my experience, doing that well, doing long well, looks qualitatively different than doing forever. So I'm going to end on a feature that's sort of near and dear to me. Not only did I grow up playing on JRPGs, and so they've been a passion of mine, I have a younger brother who's 5 years younger than me. And the ability to share rich narrative experiences where multiple people take part, actually like hold the controller and do things, it's really powerful. The format of narrative activities in JRPGs, especially the systemic ones, allow them to shine at this. Even when it's more of an afterthought to their design. The first game I played like this, I think, so I played Secret of Mana with my brother and my mom. I played Final Fantasy VI, which was Final Fantasy III. There is an option in it's turn-based combat. You could sit down with somebody else, and whenever somebody else's turn come up, you could hand the controller to them. It would be fine. It would work basically the same. But you could also go into the option menu and assign each character to a different controller. Again, you could just hand the controller, but the fact that they suggested this in the option menu, they didn't have to do any extra development for this. They didn't design around it. But we did it because it was there. And we shared this narrative experience. And that was completely different and really interesting. I want to see more cooperative storytelling. Honestly, my wife and I still gobble up every cooperative JRPG we can find, and there aren't enough of them. There are also things which I enjoyed in this space that normally I would look at that as a narrative game designer and say, nah, it's not going to work. You're not trying hard. Like, this isn't like cooperatively playing this game. You're just picking up and it worked. And on that note, that's it. Thank you. I shouldn't look at that clock. Yeah, so we have a little bit of time?
Yes, we have some time for questions.
Sure, yeah. I can do questions. We have 10 minutes. Anybody got any questions? No? Okay, no, that's fine. Oh no. all right. Let's start down here.
Okay, well, very simple and very difficult question.
Oh, great. Fantastic. In keeping with the internal contradictions of JRPGs.
Exactly.
Go.
Big feature for JRPGs for me, growing up, and especially in more modern times, have been the absolutely ridiculously overly complex, insane, super fun, super frustrating combat and leveling up systems.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure you've played your absolute fair share of these insane things. Which weird offbeat combat or leveling system would you say is your favorite?
Weird offbeat combat or leveling system. Okay, so I've said it a few times. If we're talking about weird leveling systems, I've said the Saga games. So they sort of share a leveling system across the series, but it changes and iterates over time. But the simple premise is, and this has definitely been used in other places, but if you use a thing, it's going to get stronger. Like, if you use magic, you're going to get better at magic. If you use strength, you're going to get better at strength. Later in the series, it's like if you use long swords, you're better with long swords, and if you use bows, you get better with bows. There are so many invisible parameters that they've put around that to stop that from being game. So, like, the second Final Fantasy also did that. Had the same system, and then they abandoned it for all future Final Fantasies. Now, partially that's because Final Fantasy changes it up all the time, but partially that was because Final Fantasy II was really, like, they did that, but it was a simplistic take on that, and it was really easy to game. Whereas Saga goes this, like, they've iterated on this, like, 9-10 times. So they have all these invisible things of, like, if a monster is roughly the same strength as you, then you have a chance of getting this stat up if you've used it in the battle. But over time, the monsters all scale weirdly, and so as a player, the effect is, frankly, utter confusion. Such that to play a Saga game is to either play it with a guide open at all times where people have figured out exactly how everything works, or to screw all that and be like, I have no idea what's going on, let's play. And it's sort of glorious, and like I said, leads to, I said it briefly, but leads to a sort of internal procedural storytelling because of the leveling system. Like, the story itself is not procedural, but the characters you end up with by the end would be completely different than the characters I ended up with. And my stories of those characters will be completely different, even though the literal words they say is the same. Weird combat system. So it depends on whether, like, we're talking about what is my favorite combat system in a JRPG, or, like, what do I think is the weirdest combat system in a JRPG. Because combat systems, like, I love the Final Fantasy 13 series, which unfortunately is sometimes controversial, but I think every step in that series, they ended up where I would have gone with that combat, right down to each action in Lightning Returns is mapped to a button, which you rarely get in JRPGs. And then you get to set up those buttons, and it kind of keeps a lot of what makes, like, sort of abstract number JRPG combat interesting, while also giving you the feel of an activity where I press this button and it's blocking, and I press this button and it's attacking. So it's this weird confluence of active mechanics and, like, coming out of this, not even turn-based, but more menu-based stuff. Also, the early stuff in that, like, the feel, the UI of the menus feels so good. Like, you look at, like, the little animations and the sound effects of, like, of pressing this button to put instances of fire on your bar, which are not even immediately happening. You still have to press a do this thing button. But, like, I feel good just, like, I'm gonna put some things on the bar and then cancel them, and then put some more things on the bar and cancel them, and I guess I should do something before I die. But, like, the way that they made menus feel good, like, it's up there with, like, Persona 5 in terms of, like, great feeling menus, and understanding that menus are part of your game, not, like, this weird concession that we try to consign to the side. Yeah. Okay. Go.
Thank you for the talk. I don't think I've ever played a JRPG, unless you count Undertale. I don't know whether I count Undertale. But
Is that a JRPG? Undertale. Yes? Yes. It counts. Undertale counts. There we go.
okay, apart from Undertale, I've never played JRPG. And so that was a really useful and interesting overview of it for me. And I could sort of understand why people kind of get obsessed with them.
Obsession is the right word.
Yeah. So would you, what is a good introduction to JRPG as a game that you would recommend to a
Okay. So I get to cop out of this question because it has been asked to me before in a situation where Mary quite happily answered for me, and very well, and I have not come up with a better answer yet. So Final Fantasy X is still very well regarded, holds together incredibly well. The narrative is super interesting. It uses a lot of, like, modern cinematic language, and it's aged quite well. It's also available in a lot of modern platforms. Like, you can get the remaster on Steam. You can get it for modern consoles, and on top of all that, it's a really good game. It's really good at being a JRPG. It's really good at doing all this stuff. So I think it's accessible. It's still, I think importantly, the combat is turn-based. So if you have no idea what you're doing, you can just sit there for a bit and be like, what is going on, while you select your option. It doesn't have anything that's like, what am I doing? Oh, I'm dead. Yeah?
I just would ask, there's those sort of two types of endings, kind of. One of them where, like, say, you defeat the final boss, and the game will only, if you go back to the game, it will start just before that. There'll be a save
Sure.
before you beat the final boss, and there are those where you beat the final boss and the worlds exist and go around the other things.
Sure.
Is there one of those which JRPGs change the feel of the game?
I think they happily use either. I can think of examples of both, and I think probably in those examples they chose just based on narrative framing convenience of what kind of final boss did they have. Does it make any sense that you come back from this and can go and do other things, or is that like totally, utterly breaking the framing of what's going on here? I do think that JRPGs lean on this whole New Game Plus thing partially because they want you to feel like you're still kind of playing the same game even though you've sort of run out of content. There's reasons to like be attached to your collectibles. You want to 100% this game, whatever. But there's also like nice knock-on effects because like these games are really long, right? And if you get to keep all the stuff that you gained, then that makes it that little bit easier and shorter. In some games, it makes it ridiculously streamlined. Like some games are made so that like you New Game Plus them, and between skipping cutscenes that you've seen and the fact that everything's a joke now, if you missed one thing or there was one branch of content that you just wanted to have access to, that is not quite the same, but close to just having a big scene select and being like, oh, I kind of just want to go there without having the faff of everything else. And I think when they choose how their game is going to wrap up at the ending, whether it's before or you just end up back in the world or you're expected to New Game Plus and go back in, I often think it's about that effect. How can we accommodate a player who still wants to play, wants to access things, and kind of work around the idea that, like, okay, there's a lot of gain here, there's a lot of faff, which wasn't faff at the time, but if you're redoing it is, and just trying to accommodate that. Yeah.
First, thanks for a super insightful topic on one of my all-time favorite, a super insightful talk on one of my all-time favorite topics. That's the way around it goes. I'm trying to synthesize some of the stuff you said, and I think I've come across something simple but grandiose, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree.
Okay, go for it.
I think JRPGs are participatory operas. I think they are participatory in the sense that there's a degree of interaction, but you have a limited degree of shaping. You're quite restricted in the extent to which what you do changes the overall course of this thing. Its structure remains solid, but you are invited at both the mechanical level and the larger plot level to participate in it. That's also, I think, really insightful what you said about these activities. Most JRPGs are not giant challenges, and this is I think why I'd say Dark Souls does not fit, but that's a different debate.
Sure, but that plays into, like, there's this really interesting debate over Dark Souls, like how much is challenge part of the experience? Is Dark Souls with a tourist mode still Dark Souls? And you can see how that goes right alongside, well, are they activities or challenges, or challenge the activity? How important is that to the experience? Sorry, yes.
It feels like this is something that you are being asked to be a part of something, and they want to make it feel real and engaging and that it immerses you, but it's not athletics. They're not asking you, here's a really high bar, keep getting better at it until you get over it. Yeah. They keep lowering the level up is.
Yep.
And it's an opera in the sense that it's this sort of synthetic genre that adds music and story and ensemble and text and all these things together in this very epic, usually epic frame.
Yeah.
I think when you put those things together,
I think broadly I like that description. Like when you said it, epic was the thing that I would be like, it is in general, as I pointed out, Hero's Journey, saving the world, it's a big part of the genre. I am definitely biased because I am currently making a game that I want to call a JRPG where you don't do that, and it's not epic. But yeah, exactly. And like I said, all these things that I listed that define JRPGs, you can lose one or even a couple of them or even most of them at some point and still sort of end up in what, like a Theseus ship sort of situation, and still be a JRPG. But yeah, no, that's cool. I like that. Participatory opera. Okay, so we've got. You go ahead.
Favorite usage of tea in a JRPG?
Favorite usage of tea. Ooh, how on brand. God, it's hard not to say Fire Emblem Three Heroes because I've played a lot of it. Definitely, it needs to be something where it's not just like a consumable item where you like get back magic points or something. Like that's not the essence of tea. No, I like the Fire Emblem Three Heroes where you sit with a person and having tea is an activity which is kind of more about the conversation, but you also have this mild mind reading mini game of like, what is this character's favorite tea? I have a box of like 20 teas. Some of them are really expensive and I only have one of them, and mint. and then they like politely are like, oh yes, this is good, and you're like, that wasn't it. You've go.
I want to hear more about postmodernism and acknowledging the player. I'm not sure I have a specific question for you here.
Oh, okay.
I can.
Let me see.
Like how much of it is if they don't have narrators, if you don't have this idea of a disembodied voice describes the scene to you, and you have to come up with a different way to communicate with the player. How much of that is just approaching it from a different?
Well, so I think in its simplest form in JRPGs, it's so my first example never directly addresses the player. Like I was saying, like the final boss is named creator and tells you that this whole thing has been a game. And then you fight them anyways. Like, and obviously the idea of fighting the creator of the game is a little bit like, what is even going on at this point? But there, you also had this emotional weight at that point where this whole thing, you've seen all these different personal struggles, and you get to the end and like people have died, and you've worked hard to get through on this promise of some kind of miraculous something, and you get there and this person's there sipping tea at a table and is just casually like, oh, well done. And like your characters don't even have that much narrative voice in that game, but I was right there in their decision to be like, screw you. After all that, what is this? I don't care. No. So like that's not even actually breaking the fourth wall, but it's sort of implying that we know that it's there. Now, my wife is going to kill me if I don't mention her favorite example of this, which is Batten Kaitos. So Batten Kaitos, they do break the fourth wall. They talk to the main character very quickly establishes you as a person. Like they don't narrate the experience, but you are a spirit in their world, a guardian spirit that can't really affect the world, but is assumed to be helping them with, like, giving them their powers, letting them enact things in the world. And it's used largely as a framing device. It's very early on. It's like you put in your name and they address your name, and it's why they have a different name than you put in. And it is not just a framing device, oh my god. And to say any more would do a disservice to the game. Batten Kaitos, I really don't know how accessible that is now. It was GameCube.
Is it like Batten Kaitos something Red Wings?
There's a sequel, Batten Kaitos Eternal. Oh, yeah, it has like a subheading, but Batten Kaitos is. Yeah, that's examples of that sort of thing and kind of what they do with it. Yeah, go ahead.
So you kind of covered that, like, you know, there's the line between what is a JRPG and what isn't is very fuzzy.
Yeah.
And like I guess on one end you have things like, you know, Dark Souls, that's crossing the line in some way maybe.
Mm-hmm.
What about things where, for example, the one that comes to mind is, so we have things like, what was it?
Valkyrie Profile.
That's the one with the platforming.
So yeah, when you're navigating around, it's 2D platforming. Yeah.
And then we have a lot of games with like, you know, an active battle system.
Yep.
Like
Secret of Amano is an old version where you don't go to a separate screen for fighting. You just you press a button and attack.
Like Mega Man Battle Network.
Mega Man Battle Network, yep, is also active. Yep.
What about does the line get drawn for, say, the Castlevania games that
yeah, sure.
Ego?
So this is really interesting historically, right? So the more leveling and because Castlevania is if you go way back, they didn't have levels and experience, right? Although actually I think the second one maybe did, because I played that and enjoyed it, which means it was some kind of RPG. And also, so I think a company called Nihon Falcom, which I've mentioned a couple times, which often doesn't get the same dues that Square Enix does, just because they focused on computer JRPGs for a very long time. They really took steps early on to pioneer the more action RPG stuff, including so they did a series called Dragon Slayer, which turned into Xanadu, which is going to this day, which is very action RPG. And there was a side game of that called Faxanadu, which I think as a name was a weird dig at another company, which I played and loved, but was an early example of a Metroidvania, just before that happened. And so coming from Nihon Falcom, a company that makes JRPGs, as a slight spin-off of a series that is clearly JRPGs, they've just given it this 2D platformy, explory bit, which we would recognize now as more like a Metroidvania, Castlevania thing. I would look at that game and be like, well, yeah, that's definitely a JRPG. And then you put that alongside a recent Castlevania, or I don't know, one of the DS Castlevanias. Yeah. And I think you start to run into the thing of, it's not the first descriptor I go to, but it's an interesting comparison. I think it's super interesting to put how they use and pace their leveling and experience, how they do kind of their narrative, how much of the Castlevanias are what you're doing are activities, because a lot of the activities in Castlevania are exploratory activities. Usually the things you unlock are a thing which lets me go to a new area. Yeah. And that's sort of in itself just an activity. Again, it's not going to be hard for you to double jump up those stairs or to turn into a bat, but it's still a fun, interesting thing to do and holds some kind of narrative weight. Certainly some of the Castlevanias care more about narrative than others, but I think this is my roundabout way of saying it's a really interesting comparison. Probably I don't just like Dark Souls, I don't reach for the JRPG descriptor as the first thing if I'm trying to describe this thing, especially because we have Metroidvania. If a person understands that as a descriptor, that's what you lean for, because it's the definition of it.
In some ways, it's kind of like the lineage of the thing, because it started as
exactly.
platformer and then kind of made its way to this thing, kind of like a Metroidvania, but it's got some JRPG elements.
Yes.
You're still thinking oh, this is more of a platformer thing.
Yeah, I think it's really telling that the we clump together Metroidvania for their brand of exploration, but the Castlevanias took on more the kind of leveling experience stuff, and I don't think the Metroids ever really do. It's all collectible based, and they stay away from that stuff. And so is Castlevania more of a JRPG and Metroid less because you've removed numbers? I mean, you have numbers under the missiles, but not damage numbers. Yeah, so I think that's super interesting to think about. Yes, right. Overtime. Thank you so much. Are we going to the pub? That's a thing that we're doing.
Thank you so much. I think we should do it. We might have many more questions. So I suggest that we go to the Duke of York, which is just follow us. It's just around the corner, and we can continue talking now.